Hey everyone, I'm Almar of almarsguides.com, and in this video here, I'm going to be talking about the Monk class from Classic EQ all the way until the end of Prophecy of Ro. We're going to be going over the guide that you see on screen here, which is basically the text guide that this video is based on. I'm going to be talking about everything you see in my guide here. I'm not going to be reading it word for word. I'm basically going to be giving a secondary interpretation of it for a more podcast approach for anybody that prefers that. So, to get started, monks are going to be the best melee damage class in this era, period. The only thing, sometimes berserkers will occasionally fight them on parses, and I'm pretty sure I heard about rogues taking over at one point and doing very good, I think, during Omens of War. But for the most part, you're going to be competing with every other melee and often winning on the parses. Especially from Classic to Omens of War, basically. That's your era. That is Monk era. And you're going to be doing all of that with basically just auto attack. That's more or less all you're going to do, because at least on the TLPs, you can auto skill both of the punch and the kick that you have to use. And aside from your epic gauntlets, there's not much you'll be using until like Planes of Power probably. So the drawback is it's a very boring class, is what I would say. Some monks are going to pull, however, not every monk on the raid is going to need to pull, or every monk in the group. If you're in a group, it'll either be you or a bard pulling typically. But other than that, you're more or less standing behind a monster and hitting auto attack. That's more or less what you do. So your stats are going to be the biggest benefit from all the way until the early game, until Velius/Lucklin, when you start capping them out. If you're somebody that is only doing group gear, you're not going to cap them out until Planes of Power. It's going to take you a little bit longer. And once you start maxing them out, buffs help too. Then you're going to move on to heroic stats, which we'll cover in a second. So for monks, you're going to want to prioritize strength and dexterity as your two main stats. They're going to be your two damage stats. Also, you can look for attack on gear too. There's a few items in the early eras that do come with attack. For example, Spirit Racked Cord, which is part of the Spirit Racked Urn quest, I believe. That comes with attack. It's one of the first items you can get with attack, I believe. And that will also increase your damage beyond just strength and dexterity. Much like strength and dexterity, though, attack is also going to have a cap. So that's something you'll need to keep in mind. Last but not least, you're also going to want to get something that gives you haste. That's going to be very important during these early eras, too. So, your two secondary stats that you're going to want are stamina and agility. They're going to increase your survivability. And that's more or less it as far as stats go. So once Planes of Power is released, you're going to start getting heroic stats on all of your gear. And this is going to become more and more common until basically every piece of gear will have heroic stats on it, and all of your stat-related upgrades are going to come from heroic stats. Eventually, your normal stats are basically just going to be capped, and there's nothing you can do about it, and everything's going to go towards your other stats. There will be AAs you can get to raise your regular stat caps as well, but eventually that's a non-issue. So for a monk, your main heroic stat is going to be heroic dexterity. That is going to give you the most benefit to damage that you can get. Other than that, heroic strength is going to give you a very, very, very minor boost, so little that you're probably not even going to be able to notice it on the parse. Depends on the era, though. And heroic agility and heroic stamina are going to both give you survivability. You want to primarily focus on heroic dexterity, and then heroic agility and heroic stamina as secondaries. Heroic strength should be the thing you are least focused on as far as heroic stats go. Also, once the game reaches Omens of War / Prophecy of Ro, kind of in that era, you're going to want to start learning more and more about heroic stats and what they do. So I have this right up here that you see on the screen now. This is from my website. And I also linked to 3 other write-ups of heroic stats. And this will give you a lot of information about heroic stats, what they do, which ones you want, etc., etc. So let me show you in-game real fast, too. Oops, wrong window. Let me open my inventory. We'll go to stats. And if you see this heroic mods in the top right corner of stats, if you mouse over these numbers, it will tell you how many heroic points you need to raise that stat. Accuracy is going to be one of the more important ones for you on the monk. But you also see some of these are raised by heroic strength too, like that. And that will also those are kind of important because when you're fighting an enemy with a damage shield, you'll take less damage. So it basically everything helps in the end, and it's funny to think that heroic strength gives you more survivability than it does actual damage. But that's how you can see what the soft caps are for heroic stats. If you mouse over these, it will tell you what the soft caps are. And then once you're over the soft cap, you're going to get diminishing returns. So important focus effects. This is the next thing. So for you, I should say focus effects are added in Lucklin, and your focus effects, the good ones, you're not going to be able to get them until LDON and Omens of War, because I don't even know if they exist. Or I should say, I think I've seen them on Lucklin gear, and I'm pretty sure I will see them on Planes of Power gear. But in Lucklin, they're very far and few between. So haste, it's not really a focus, but you want it. Cleave is going to be your most important focus, with ferocity being your second most important focus. Those are what you will get to raise your melee DPS. So improved dodge and improved parry/block are secondary. They're not they increase your survivability, but it's not your damage, so they're less important. So as I say here, and as I said earlier, during this era of the game, monks are going to be pressing very few buttons. Your auto attack is going to be it, basically, and you're also going to have this command on TLPs /auto skill. This will allow you to auto skill something like Dragon Punch, Eagle Strike, or Tail Rake, Round Kick, Flying Kick. So you'll typically, from my understanding, want to do Dragon Punch and Flying Kick. Flying Kick, I'm 100% sure, is the one that you want to use. However, I've heard debates between Eagle Strike and Dragon Punch on which one is better. This is an example of a macro, if you want to look at the screen now, for those of you that are basically just listening like it's a podcast. That's an example of a macro that you'll want to make on the monk, which is going to use an item. That right there, it's using the monk fist, which I have it set up in a way that I wouldn't recommend it. I would actually recommend you just type out the name of the monk epic, which is Celestial Fists, I think. And then this is how you set up an alt activate, which is an AA. So the AA here that I'm using as an example is Xanfi's Whistle, and the top one is the Monk Epic. I'll show you how to do this differently in a little bit, and technically better. And also, you can use /doability. This is something else that will allow you to use things like Flying Kick and Eagle Strike if you can't auto skill them. The only way that you can't auto skill them is if you're on like an emulator or a private server or something like that. So AAs are the next thing I would like to talk about, and for that, I'm going to go in-game and show you. We're only going to cover the clicky AAs too. So starting in Lucklin, we're looking at Purify Body. This is going to cure you of, it's basically a cure. It's going to purge any detrimental effects from your body. Dragon Force, this is a knockback, and I personally never use it on my monk. I can see it being useful for some situations, but not many, if I'm being honest. Distance Strike. This is basically an AA that replaces Throw Stone, the disc that you have, and it gives you more range too. It's basically just a way to pull so you don't have to keep making javelins or whatever you're making. So in Gates of Discord, you're going to get your first burns, your melee burns. So looking at this, if you read it, it's basically saying that when activated, your primary slot rounds are going to hit all targets within a 40-foot radius and with an additional melee round for 12 seconds. I'm going to drink too because my throat's getting a little parched. So you can see it hits your opponents for less than it hits your primary target, but that's okay because it still works as more or less an AoE. And it's one of the things you'll be popping with your burns, and you're also going to be popping discs. We're going to talk about that when we go back to the website, so I can actually give you the discs by name. But this, Destructive Force and Focus Destructive Force, both will share a cooldown, so you can only use one. And from my understanding, you're primarily using Destructive Force. So Omens of War, Imitate Death. This is giving you a fade combined with a feign death, which will allow you to basically get out of... It's a get out of jail free card, more or less, that allows you to escape combat. Nothing in Dragons of Norath, nothing in Depths of Dark Hollow, and nothing in Prophecy of Ro. So we can go back to the website. As you can see, you don't get very many AAs. There's not much that monk get that they can activate during this era. That changes a little bit in the future. You'll get a lot more burns and cooldowns as time goes on. So now we're going to go over your disciplines. This is something you will get a lot of during this era. So here's your offensive discs. So Thunder Kick is one that I use. I'm only in Luckland right now. Sorry, hiccup. I'm only in Luckland right now, and Thunder Kick is one that I like a lot, and I use basically Thunder Kick and Inner Flame together. Or not together, like at the same time, but those are the two that I end up using. But Inner Flame is one of the better ones, and Ashen Hand Disc, I believe, is part of our main. Let's see. Yes. So those two are the main ones you use for your burns. Inner Flame and Thunder Kick. Ashen Hand is typically put as a secondary, which I'll explain that more in detail down there, but I had to double check my own guide. Speed Focus. This is going to be an important one once you're actually given it because it gives you 100 hands effect. I can't really explain what that is since there's no exact write-up of what it actually is. So that's a bit of a bummer. Rapid Kick is something that reduces your kick skill timer. And you can see just here, the list goes on. I'll explain more of these later because some of these are useless, some of them are good, etc., etc. Most of the ones that I have listed here, though, are ones that are useful. And you can see on my site, too, I also tell you where to get many of these. And what, quests are involved in them. Defensive discs. So your offensive disc, a lot of these will share cooldowns, and they will not share cooldowns with these, your defensive discs. So like Stone Stance, for example, increases melee mitigation by 90%. When you pull aggro, you might want to pop that. Also, if you're soloing, you may want to use that. And it has a long cooldown, but every bit of mitigation helps. My advice here is to, whenever it comes to disciplines, you want to put all of your disciplines on a bar and see which ones share cooldowns. Because that tells you which ones are the best, basically. Because then you can use all of the ones that don't share cooldowns and figure out which ones are the best that do share a cooldown. Eventually, during Prophecy of Ro, you're going to get this right here. Master's Aura and Disciple's Aura. This will increase your group's chance to dodge, parry, and riposte, and you're going to be using this basically at all times once you actually do get it. And Fists of Wu, this is something you're going to be using at all times too once you actually get it. They're basically buffs that you're going to be able to cast on your group and on yourself that are good. The aura will last longer. Fists of Wu is going to be a short duration buff. And these are other disciplines too. So this, what you see here, these phantom abilities, these give you a pacify pull, basically a way to pull with pacify since you didn't have that prior to the phantoms. And here's a how to play monk basics. So this is the section a lot of you are probably waiting for, and it's going to boil down to basically use auto attack with some variations. So if you're going to play a monk on a raid, I would recommend setting up a bar like this. I have a few example skills that I am using here. So Xanfi's Whistle, which is something you don't get until later in the game. Two-Finger Wasp Punch, again, something you don't get until later in the game. These two, Flying Kick, Tiger Claw, and then the Epic Macro that I made. You'll notice in the top right here, each of these says 1. What this means is when you hit 1, which is going to be probably most people's DPS key, I'd assume, it's going to use all 5 of these basically at the same time. It'll use some of them, skip one and then use another one and then come back and hit that one. But this is a very effective way of doing DPS in this game and spamming all of your skills at the same time. If you try to put them in a macro like this, what I did above, it's going to give you slower cast times when you hit that macro. It's going to take like maybe 0.25 seconds to get through each line of the macro, and that is just not good. That will cost you massive amounts of DPS as time goes on. Thankfully, in this era of the game, like I said, most of your damage is going to come from auto attack. And that kind of stays true, but eventually you are going to need to make a hotbar like this that spams all of your skills when you hit whatever damage button you have set up. And a lot's going to go in there. By the time the game gets to level 100, you're going to have about 10 or 11 different skills that are going to be bound to one that you're going to be spamming. So it's important for you to keep that in mind, and it might be a habit you want to pick up sooner rather than later. So you can see here I explain a bit about use item, macros, hotbars. You can see here I do /use item /steal fists. That's what would be in the epic macro. That's how you would be able to use that item anywhere in your inventory. So no matter what slot it is in, what bag it's in, etc., use item /steal fists will always use it when it's in your inventory. So now for the final part, monk rotations and burns. So now that I've explained more or less everything else, it's time to look over what your proper burns are. So in Kunark, Velius, and Lucklin, you're going to be using Inner Flame and Thunder Kick. Those are the two main ones. From what I've read, Thunder Kick is less damage than Inner Flame, but for some reason, I think Thunder Kick does more damage than Inner Flame. That's what I've noticed when boxing my monks, because on Teak, I do a 6-box, and my DPS is monks. I personally think Thunder Kick does more damage than Inner Flame, but the math apparently says otherwise, according to what I've seen people post. And by that, I've said here, if you look at the bottom of my page, Monk TLP POP/GUD era Google Doc, this one right here, he does a lot of the math for stuff, like you can see here. Inner Flame, 38.55 DPS increase. And then there was Thunder Kick. He said DPS increase of 11.3. I don't know if I would agree with that, but sure. And then Inner Ashen Hand, or actually he said this, it increases flying kick DPS by 70%, but an overall DPS increase of 11.3. More or less, I always like to link at the bottom here of where I got my research from, if you'd like to double check that. And then this right here, EQ Freelance, is a very, very good guide, although it's kind of above our era, if I'm being honest. It's not going to be as useful to you. And then also EQ Progressions has a decent monk guide too, which you can go over if you would like. So once POP is added, you're going to use Speed Focus as your primary disc. That's the one that gave 100 Hands effect earlier. And then once Gates of Discord is released, you're going to pair Speed Focus with that Focus Destructive Force disc that I showed you earlier. Both of those are going to be used in your burn rotation to maximize your DPS. Once Prophecy of Ro is added, you're going to add Heal of Kanji into your burn rotation as well. Let's see, Heal of Kanji. Yeah. So it's a pretty good one, as you can see. Increases flying kick damage and chance to hit, and it also reduces the cooldown timer from it. And then, like I told you before, you're also going to be wanting to use Master's Aura and Fists of Wu. They're buffs, though. They're not going to be part of your rotation. As for our normal rotation, you're going to be using the Monk Epic along with Dragon Fang once you get it during Dragons of North. And that's more or less it for this whole entire era. Those are the two main things you're going to be hitting. You'll get Fists of Wu in DODH, but that's not going to go, like, you don't bind that to 1 because you'll cast it too much and it'll burn through your stamina like crazy. You'll cast that before battle and during battle when you need it. Monk Epic and Dragon Fang, those are the buttons that would go onto 1 that you spam. Alternatively, you could also put Monk Epic onto something else if you only wanted to cast it once every 17 seconds or whatever it is. That would actually probably get you, you'd have more DPS that way. So that's something to consider. But anyway, that's really all there is to it for the Monk Guide. If you guys would like to learn more than what you see in this guide, check out my website. You can see more tips and tricks at the bottom. I also link to other guides. And that's really all there is to it. Hopefully this video helped you guys out. Hopefully you learned something. If you did, be sure to leave me a like because that helps me out. And I will catch you guys around in future Everquest videos. Peace.